in Jewish tradition. I'm a little distressed that there's only 3 or 4 men, so you know what, we're going to talk behind their back. The ones that stayed home. If you have somebody that stayed home, you'll have to tell them everything we said when they were not here to hear. It's obviously a very vast subject, so I will only be able to make some headlines of what I see as key issues in the status of women in Jewish law. And when I talk about Jewish law, I'm primarily talking about halakha, Jewish law, which primarily means texts that have their origins in the Tanakh, in the Bible, but really are elucidated as legal rulings in the Mishnah, the Talmud, the medieval commentaries, the medieval and early modern consolidations of Jewish law. So what I want to say is there will be plenty of time for questions and about what I say and what I didn't say. If I use a term or say something that I think everybody knows but you don't understand, please stop me, because I start talking and I forget that I'm not talking in Swedish. Anyway, so we're going to start with the laws of marriage. Why? Because in terms of halakha, in terms of Jewish law, girls, before they enter puberty and become eligible for marriage, are of no interest. There's nothing practically that I can think of that pertains to the status of girls prior to puberty. There obviously are texts about educating children. They're much more focused on educating boys, and we can derive teachings about the status of girls, but really the Jewish texts are not interested in girls prior to sexual maturation, and then very quickly thereafter they become eligible for marriage. And the first question that enters the discussion is, at what point is a girl an adult and eligible for marriage? And there are sort of two, we're not going to actually read these texts, so I'm summarizing. There's 2 trains that leave 2 different stations but sort of go along the same lines. One is physiological maturation, and the rabbis are very interested in how do you know when a girl has reached sexual maturation, and simply chronological age. And they basically assume that in most cases they happily meet around age 12, which is the age of the bat mitzvah, and that's where a girl is an adult physiologically and legally, and can then be asked by her father, do you want to marry Lasse, or do you want to marry this guy over there in the corner? The rabbis say a man should wait, because marriages are arranged by the father if he's alive, and if the father is not alive, by older brothers or uncles. Whoever is the man who runs the legal affairs of the family. But the rabbis say you should wait until your daughter has reached maturity and ask her who does she want to marry. That said, marriages of course are not what we are used to today, but they are arranged by the parents, but there is consideration for the wishes of the girl.
And what is maturity in this case?
12.
So still is 12.
The age of 12, yes. Now, there is discussion in the Talmud of at what age you should marry. They're more interested in at what age should a man marry, because a man has 3 trains: physiology, chronology of age, and studying Torah. And they have to converge somewhere too. Technically, a young boy is considered a man at age 13, but in fact he's expected in the rabbinical class, which is primarily what the rabbis are interested in themselves, just like us. He is expected to study optimally until the age of 18 and marry sometime between 18 and early 20s. That seems to be the assumption. There's one rabbi who says, I'm better than the rest of you. He's talking to his friends, the other rabbis, because I married at age 14. Why is he better? Because there was a period between age 14, this is still true today, until marriage, where sexuality is fully developed. And if you're not married, then you have to deal with sexual temptations and masturbation and all of this stuff that happens when you don't have an outlet. And he says, I didn't have any of these problems because I was already married. But the other rabbis told them to sit down and stop bragging, because really they're concerned with boys studying Torah before they marry. And they say, how can you study Torah when you have a millstone around your neck? And when they're talking about a millstone, they're talking about a millstone. In other words, a huge thing made out of stone. Meaning, once you're married, you have family obligations towards your wife, towards your children, towards your household. How are you going to be able to sit all day and study Torah when you have all these obligations? So their preference is for boys to marry between roughly 18 and early 20s. And the assumption, even it's not clearly specified, is that the girl is usually a few years younger. But probably not generally 12, probably more 14, 15, 16, something like that. So, the basic rule of marriage is very simple. The tractate and the section of the Talmud, Mishnah and the Talmud that talks about the laws of marriage is called Kiddushin. Kiddushin means betrothal, in other words, undertaking the legal act that confers the status of marriage. And it starts, האישה נקנית בשלוש דרכים, a woman is acquired in marriage, and it's not acquired as you buy a falafel in a falafel stand. It's a very specific technical terms for conferring the status of marriage in three ways, and acquires her freedom in two. She's acquired the kesef, either by an exchange of money, which is what we usually do today. The ring represents money. By shtar, by a contract, which is a written contract that is usually signed by the groom and the father of the girl, not the girl herself, or by intercourse. Intercourse, of course, becomes an immediate problem, and that's the first text that we're going to see. And a woman acquires her freedom, meaning she becomes a free agent and she can marry someone else either by the death of her husband, which usually she's not expected to have anything to do with that happening. But you never know. Or divorce. So once a woman becomes a widow or a divorcee, then she is free to marry someone else. So, as I said, of those three ways, exchange of money is a symbolic transaction. Actually, a written contract is more detailed and more specific. And intercourse requires the least amount of preparation and is the most amount of fun. So immediately that becomes a problem, and we'll see in the first text that you have in your hands, which is from the Babylonian Talmud, a few pages after the beginning. A certain man betrothed with a myrtle branch in the marketplace, with a branch of a tree that you use for Sukkot, so it's worth a few pennies. Thereupon Rabbi Acha ben Huna sent to Rabbi Yosef and asked, how is the law, how is it in such a case? He, in other words, Rabbi Yosef, sent back, quote, have him flogged in accordance with Rav, and demanded divorce in accordance with Shmuel, with Samuel. In other words, not good. Not good performing a marriage with something that is literally worth the pruta, the penny that you need in order to transact the marriage, but you're just doing it willy-nilly in a marketplace without arrangements, without the parents, without the party. So that should be flogged. He should be flogged. He should get a good beating, but he should also be forced to give her a divorce. Why? Because technically she's already married. Because he gave her something that's worth a pruta, 1 penny. Okay, next. For Rav, so now he's explaining why. Rav, who is a very important legal authority, punished anyone who betroths in the marketplace or by intercourse or without prior engagement or who annulled the divorce, etc., etc. So Rav, even though the letter of the law is that you can effect marriage with an exchange of a pruta, a penny, a contract, or intercourse, Rav says, no, we're not doing it that way. So he added another layer to the law, and he punished anybody who tried to marry somebody just in the marketplace, or with just intercourse, or without prior engagement, shibuchim, without the consent of the parents, etc. And then there's another, the Nehardeans, which is a town in Babylonia. This is all from the Babylonian Talmud, which was codified in today's Iraq, sometime in the 6th to early 7th century. Used to be given a specific date, but now it's more fluid. So each town had a slightly different custom. The Nehardeans maintained for all of those Rav inflicted no punishment, excepting for betrothal by intercourse without prior arrangement. Others state even with prior arrangement on account of licentiousness. In other words, they're trying to take this basic law that they have that goes back to the Mishnah, which is codified around the year 200, that says that's how you do it, and says, well, let's figure out the way that we actually eliminate intercourse as a way of affecting marriage. And the reasons are obvious, because it's not socially acceptable to have no prior arrangement, no consent of the parents, no contract negotiation, and it might encourage people to have sex just for the fun of it, which is not what the rabbis want. The rabbis want sex to be, intercourse to be part of affecting a marriage after you did it in the proper way. Nevertheless, they are sort of stuck with this problem, which is technically, according to the basic requirements of the law, it's very easy to marry. And there are many other stories in the Talmud, like my favorite is a woman is walking down the street and she's under a big palm tree. And there's a guy who climbed all the way up and he's picking dates. And she says, hey, throw me some dates down. And he says, I'll throw you some dates if you marry me for the worth of these dates. And she says, throw them down already. He throws them down and then he comes down and says, now we're married. So that doesn't happen. So, but the fundamental thing that's important here is that the rabbis actually tried to make it consistently, despite these restrictions, they tried to make it very easy to marry, because they're pro-marriage. They're pro-marriage, they're in favor of fairly early marriage, creating families and procreation, and they don't want to have any economic barriers to marriage. Which becomes a very important issue, obviously, in communities where there is poverty, and it's very difficult to get together enough money to, if it requires a dowry of a substantial amount of money. Nevertheless, of course, if you came from a very wealthy family, your father, if you were a girl in a wealthy family, your father made sure that there was a contract, a shtar, written out before with all the details of the financial arrangements. And you can see that if you, in the text of the Ketubah, the Jewish marriage contract that we still use today, that there's an attempt to set a minimum amount of money that is promised. It is actually not a wedding gift. It's not necessary in order to affect marriage. It's a divorce insurance. So the husband says, should this marriage be dissolved either because of my death or because of a divorce, at the point of right before the wedding, he promises to pay a substantial amount of money to the woman in case the marriage ends. Okay, so now, what's this marriage thing good for? So, of course, if you go back to the biblical text, the very definition of marriage in Genesis, it says that a woman is taken from a man's body. And it says, and therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife. So, you could say that the purpose of marriage is to be able to leave home. But I think that would be kind of backwards. But you need to leave your parents in order to be able to marry. And it seems like in the biblical text, the main emphasis is on companionship and on the bond between husband and wife. And that's there throughout the rabbinic texts as well. But of course, the issue of procreation comes up both in the Bible, because as soon as there's a man and a woman, God says to them, be fruitful and multiply, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, etc. So now we're jumping to the 13th century, only because this is a very abbreviated version of the text I want to talk about, which talks about what is the point of marriage. So this is Yaakov ben Asher, who wrote the Al-Ba'aturim, which is one of the first codes of Jewish law, an attempt to take a very large body of law that has evolved over centuries and organize it by topic and in logical sequence. Okay, so he is talking about marriage. And he says, blessed be the name of God who desires the good of his creation. So marriage is an expression of God's blessings to his creations, or her creations, depending on your point of view. For he knows that it is not good for man to be alone. So the first thing he says has to do with companionship, with the need to be with a soulmate. Next comes procreation. And that the purpose of the creation of man is procreation and multiplication, and that it's not possible without a mate. Therefore, and this is a traditional translation of the Hebrew text, so all the references to God are as he. Please change those in your mind as you wish, but it'll make it go faster. Therefore, he commanded him to cleave to his mate, to the mate he had made for him. So that's back to that text in Genesis. Therefore, a man is required to marry a wife in order to procreate and multiply. So this is a new idea, which does appear already in the rabbinic text, that it's not only a blessing and a privilege to marry for a man, but not for a woman. It's actually a legal obligation. Men are required to marry. Women are expected to marry, but they're not required according to Jewish law. They do it voluntarily. Okay, so therefore man is required, and he who does not engage in procreation is like one who spills blood. For it is written, etc., man's blood. I'm skipping a little bit. He who does not procreate lessens the image of God and causes the divine spirit of Shekhinah to depart from Israel. And whoever lives without a wife lives without well-being, without blessing, without a home, without Torah, without a protective wall, without peace. So these are all the good things that you get if you get married. And it's interesting that one of them is without Torah, which is generally, basically the study of Torah is restricted to men. But the concept here is that in order to be able to study Torah in the proper way, you have to be within the structure of a marriage. Rabbi Eliezer said, whoever has no wife is not a man, and excuse me, once he marries a woman, his transgressions vanish into thin air, as it is written, he who has found a wife has found well-being and shall please God. So this is really pro-marriage propaganda without all the stops. Yes.
It says here without a protective wall.
Yes.
What does it mean?
Okay, so that refers to being married. Of course, this all assumes heterosexual orientation and heterosexual marriage. So a man who is married has a wife with whom he can fulfill his sexual needs. If he doesn't have a wife, he is unprotected from temptations. So the wife creates this protection from sexual thoughts and temptations outside of marriage. Okay, let's move on. So we're going to come back to procreation in a second, but before procreation, I want to talk about sexuality. So in addition to emotional companionship, there's also a lot of talk about sexual companionship or sexual fulfillment. And what's interesting here is, as you'll see in a second, just like men are required to marry but women are not, men are required to guarantee their wife's sexual pleasure and women are not. So in Exodus, it talks about when a man has a wife and takes a second wife, because of course in the biblical law, you're allowed to have multiple wives, he must not reduce the food, clothing, or ona of his original wife. So food and clothing is pretty obvious. and actually the rabbis then said that it actually means food, clothing, shelter, medical care, burial needs, basically all of the physical necessities. But what is ona? It says she'arak suta ve'onota. So now the rabbis in the Mishnah try to explain what is this term ona. Mishnah. If a man forbade himself by vow to have intercourse with his wife, okay, so the basic assumption is for some reason, which we won't go into a lot of details of why, a man says, I'm not going to have intercourse. And he's doing it basically as a form of self-denial, as a religious practice, as a kind of a monastic practice. So if a man says, I'm not going to have intercourse with my wife, assuming obviously he's not going to have intercourse with anybody else, he's denying himself the sexual pleasure. Bet Shammai ruled she must consent to the deprivation for 2 weeks. Bet Hillel ruled only for 1 week. And as you know, generally the halacha follows Bet Hillel, which is more thought of as more lenient, but it depends on the context. So how do we know this? Where did Bet Hillel come up with the idea of 1 week? So now they're telling us another tradition. Students may go away to study the Torah without the permission of their wives for a period of 30 days. Laborers only for 1 week. So this is another teaching that says if you are a rabbinical student, you can go and study because you might want to go to a different town to study because not every town has a good yeshiva. And you are, because your profession is that you are a student of Jewish law, you can go for up to 40 days, even if your wife doesn't want you to. If you're an everyday man and you just are a worker, up to 1 week in order to study Torah, because even people who are ordinary workers may sometimes decide, I'm going to take a sabbatical, come to Paideia, but only for 1 week. And they can go away for a week without the wife's permission. How do we know that? The times for conjugal duty, ona, the times for an ona prescribed in the Torah are, for men of independence, every day. That's men who don't have to work for a living. I don't know if anybody is married to one of these. For men of independence, every day. For laborers, so these are people who do manual labor, twice a week. For ass drivers, once a week, because they go with their donkey from one village to the other, and they only come home for the weekend. For camel drivers, which, as you know, camels go for much longer, once in 30 days, and for sailors, once in 6 months. Now you know why there's no Jewish sailors. These are the rulings of Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer says this is the parameters that we function with. Obviously, your sexual obligation as a husband to offer to have sex with your wife has to somehow work with your profession. That's the category. So if your profession requires you to go on a camel for 30 days and you're supposed to have sex every week, you can't practice your profession. So what's interesting, well, there are many interesting things, but what's interesting to me is that if you have no work obligations, you're required to offer your sexual services every day. So the assumption is every day your wife might be interested. Now, when I tell this, people usually raise their hand and they say, but what about nida? What about the prohibition on sexual relations during menstruation, which is a period of usually 7 days, from the beginning of menstruation through menstruation. You're not allowed to have sexual relations. You're not even allowed to touch each other. So people say, okay, so a week after every month is out of consideration. And if your menstruation is a little bit irregular, then even more than a week. That, of course, is true. However, in traditional Jewish society, in other words, prior to the 19th century, most women spent most of their fertile life not menstruating. They were either pregnant or nursing. Once they started menstruating again, within 2-3 months, they got pregnant again. So the whole idea that a lot of people have that in traditional Jewish society, women could not have sex half the time every month is wrong. because menstruation was very unusual. It was an unusual occurrence, which actually explains why the rabbis were a little bit unclear on how frequently it was supposed to come. Because it was irregular. So, so the obligation here, the obligation of Hana is on the man. The man is required to offer to have sex. The woman is allowed to say, not today, I have a headache. In fact, there is actually a rabbinic text about a woman who says, I have a headache. So it's not a new invention. And he cannot force her. He cannot, other texts talk about rape within marriage and say, if a man says to his wife, I'm a donkey driver and says here once a week, or I'm a laborer, it says right here twice a week, whether you like it or not, and he forces her to have sex on the basis of this, that's considered rape in Jewish law. So the assumption underlying all of this, of course, is that the woman generally goes along and generally is interested in having sex, both for sexual pleasure and also because women are assumed to want to procreate, to have children. Nevertheless, it's very important to understand that the obligation to offer sexual pleasure rests on the man's shoulder, and the woman always has the option to say, no, thank you. Okay, so we're moving very fast, and you'll have to forgive me for that. So now we know how often. And the next question that pertains to the sexual experiences of women is how? What can you do and what can't you do? So this is the next text, number 4. This is also from the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai said, the ministering angels, Malachei Asherei, whom we sing about on Friday night, told me 4 things. People are born lame because their parents overturned the table. Dumb, in other words, mute, because they kiss that place. Deaf because they converse during intercourse. Blind because they look at that place being the female genitalia. Rabbi Yochanan says the above is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai, but he can go wherever he wants to go. The sages, the majority opinion says the halacha is not, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai said, but rather a man may do whatever he pleases with his wife. In other words, we have a minority opinion that's quite restrictive, that is rejected, and says that's his opinion, but we, the rabbis, we don't agree. We basically says you do whatever you please. You want to kiss the genitals, you can kiss the genitals. You want to talk during sex talk about the stock market, you can talk during sex. You want actually another text says that you cannot talk about the stock market. You can only talk about things that are sexually arousing, or about what wonderful children might result from this sexual act. So only stuff that pertains to the activity. What is turning the table? We'll find out in a minute. So then they continue for a while, and then an actual case is brought up to prove this point. A woman once came before Rabbi. This is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the one who is assumed to have organized the whole project of codifying the Mishnah. So he was the top guy in his generation. So whatever he says is authoritative. So a woman once came before Rabbi and said, Rabbi, I've set a table for my husband, but he has overturned it. Rabbi replied to her, my daughter, the Torah has permitted you to him. What then can I do for you? Okay, so this is a euphemistic language, and we have to understand it. Anybody want to hazard a guess of what turning the table means? Yeah. Anal sex is one possibility. And the other possibility is a little bit more modest. It's the woman on top. But whatever a table is supposed to stand this way, it's upside down. Something is upside down. And there are other texts later that try to say it could be this or it could be this, but the point is, it's not the commonly used sexual positions. And it's interesting to think about, what does this woman think about it? Does she like turning the table, or is she coming and complaining about it? The text is a little bit unclear, but Rabbi Judas, he doesn't seem to be that interested in her. He just wants to tell her that the law is that you could do whatever you want, so there's no legal basis for intervening. Okay, let's continue. So now we come back, close the circle again to one of the main reasons for marriage and sex is obviously procreation. And we're going to look at it through the issue of the obligation to procreate. Okay, so this is also from the Babylonian Talmud. Mishnah, a man is commanded concerning the duty of propagation, but not a woman. Okay, so a man is commanded to procreate, but a woman is not. Now that's a little strange, right? Because this is a long time ago. This is the year 200. They had to have a man and a woman. Maybe eventually we won't, but certainly in the year 200, they had to have when they didn't have any other way of doing it. But they're making a very particular effort to say men are legally obligated to procreate, but women are not. We'll see in a minute why. But a woman is not. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch, however, so that's the majority opinion, that the man is obligated and women are not, but then there's a minority opinion of Yochanan ben Baruch who said, wait a minute, it says right there in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That is in the plural form. It implies a man and a woman, and at that point there are only two people on earth, a man and a woman, so it has to include women. Now the discussion in the Talmud, in the Gemara. Where is this Jews? How do we come up with this idea that men are obligated and women are not? Rabbi Biale replied in the name of Rabbi Elazar, etc. The Bible says, and replenish the earth and subdue it. In Hebrew, be fruitful and multiply, umil'u et haaretz, fill the earth, vekivshuha, and subdue it or conquer it or take possession of it. And then he says it's the nature of a man to subdue, to conquer. It's not the nature of a woman. So therefore, the first part of the sentence, because the last word in the sentence only applies to men, therefore the first part of the sentence also applies to men. You can see that this is a pretty weak argument. He's trying very hard to prove it. Now we're going to skip a little bit. There's another opinion that says no, but we base it on another passage where God speaks to Jacob in the single male form, and women are not included there. So now what is the decision? So in other words, these biblical texts are not sufficient for making a determination because they contradict each other. Come and hear what Rabbi Acha ben Chanina stated in the name of Rav Abba. You notice that they never speak in their own name. They always hang it on somebody who came before them. Who was a greater authority, which by the way is exactly the way they do it in Islamic interpretation. You always hang it on, it's in the name of so-and-so, who learned it from so-and-so, and you try to go as many generations as you can to give it more authority. Such a case once came before Rabbi, in other words, we don't know what case, but let's say some kind of a situation came before Rabbi Yochanan at the synagogue of Caesarea, and he decided that the husband must divorce her and also pay her the amount of the ketubah. So this is a little strange, let me explain it. Some kind of a case came before the rabbi. A woman explained to him her situation. We don't know what it was. We have to figure it out. And he said, I'm going to compel your husband to divorce you. And he's also going to have to pay you the full amount. Remember, I mentioned that the ketubah, the marriage contract, guarantees the woman a certain payment in case of divorce. That is not the case if the woman does something to violate her obligations in the marriage. So this woman apparently came to the rabbi and says, I want a divorce because, and this is, I'm going to save you a lot of trying to sort it out, because she doesn't have any children. So at first you would think that, well, she's not obligated to have children, so on what basis would her husband be forced to divorce her? So stay with me. Now, if it's suggested that the woman is not subject to the commandment of procreation, how could she have any claim to her ketubah? In other words, there has to be a legal reason why her husband can be compelled to divorce her. And if she's not required to procreate, what's the reason? There's no basis to it for the rabbi to intervene and to do that. And the answer is, it's possible that this was the case, was like a case where she submitted a special age plea, age 3. As was another case. So this is frequently how they do it in the Talmud. They say, we don't know what to do with this case, but it's just like that case. And we know what was done there, so that we're, okay, so what's the other case? A certain woman came to Rabbi Ami and asked him to order the payment of her ketubah. In other words, asked him to force her husband to divorce her and pay her ketubah, meaning that her rights were somehow violated and her husband is in the wrong. He says to her, not very politely, go away, the commandment does not apply to you. In other words, go away because you're not required to procreate, so I can't force your husband to divorce you. There's no legal grounds. He hasn't violated any of your rights. And she exclaimed, what should become of a woman like myself in her old age? In such a case, the master said, we certainly compel him to divorce her. In other words, she says, essentially, she says, I have no children. What's going to happen to me when I'm old? Essentially, she's saying, I have the right to have children who will take care of me in old age. For whatever reason, they don't have children. She wants to try to have children with another man because she is guessing that the problem is with her husband. And she's essentially saying, not I'm obligated to procreate, but I have a right to procreate. And he agrees with her and forces her husband to divorce her. Does that all make sense?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, you can all be rabbis. All right, so we're going to skip yet another case like that strengthens that, and we're going to go to the last paragraph. Judah and Hezekiah were twins. The features of one were developed at the end of 9 months, and those of the other developed at the beginning of the 7 months. In other words, this is a little hard to follow, but these were twins who were born together. One was much more developed than the other. So they reasoned that they developed at different rates, and one was fully mature and the other one was not. Which is something that doesn't happen, but what does happen is a situation which is called twin-to-twin transfusion, where one of the twins receives most of the nourishment and is much larger than the other one. And that's a very dangerous situation for both of the babies, and also usually makes for a very difficult birth because one baby is too big. So Judah says, now we're on the third line. Judith, the wife of Rabbi Chia, having suffered in consequence agonizing pains of childbirth. So this is not the usual agonizing pains of childbirth. This is like beyond the usual agonizing pain. The rabbis recognize that giving birth is very painful, but this is beyond that. She changed her clothes after she recovered from the birth and appeared before Rabbi Chia. Now remember, that's actually her husband. But he doesn't seem to know who she is because it doesn't say, hi honey, what are you doing here? She appears before him, she changes, maybe instead of changing her clothes, she changes her whole appearance. Maybe she's wearing a beard, a fake beard. And she says to him, is a woman, she asked, commanded to propagate the earth, commanded to procreate? No, he replied. And relying on this decision, she drank a sterilizing potion. When her action finally became known to him, to her own husband, he exclaimed, would that you bore unto me only one more issue of the womb. In other words, she asks him, are women required to procreate? He says no. She takes the consequences and she sterilizes herself. After a certain amount of time, I don't know how long, it doesn't say, maybe 3-4 years, no more children, finally he says, what's going on? How come you're not getting pregnant again? And she tells him what she did, and he says, oh, if you had only given me one more child. What's interesting is that it's clearly told in a very emotional, sort of human drama way. We see his feelings. we see her feeling that she has to protect herself because the birth was so agonizing. And from a legal point of view, what's important is he doesn't challenge that what she did was legal. He doesn't say, how could you do that? It's not legal. Of course, she was very smart. She went and asked her own husband the question. So she covered herself. But nevertheless, what's important is this, you can see that this confirms very strongly the idea that women are not required to procreate. I see you, just 1 second. Not only are they not required to procreate, but in this case, a woman actually does something quite radical and she sterilizes herself. And she will never have children again because she's not required to. Yes?
I'm not sure if I could follow. Does it say anywhere explicitly that a woman has a right to have children?
Yes, not explicitly, not in that term, but when a woman says, what will become of me in old age, the implication is I have the right to have children who will take care of me. And there's a little passage that we skipped where a woman says, in the middle there, does not a woman like myself require a staff in her hand, in other words, a stick to lean on, and a hoe for digging her grave? In other words, somebody who will bury her, and she's not relying on her husband to do that.
But how can she
The
demand
children,
that?
her children are the ones that she relies on who will take care of her in old age and bury her.
But how can she demand that if it's not written that she is entitled to have children?
That's why this is here. This is to
Okay.
show you that in fact the rabbis are saying, even though women are exempt from the obligation, they have the right to have children. You cannot deny them the right to have children.
So this is the legal
This is
ground.
the legal
Okay.
place right here.
Uh-huh.
Right. So, like a lot of material in halakha, they don't sit down and say, this is the law, this is the law, this is the law.
Mhm.
They say, this is an opinion, how do we know this? And then they usually tell, very much like this, they bring these stories which prove it.
Mhm.
But there isn't actually a statement that says, at the beginning it says, men are required to procreate, but women are not. As a general statement, then we have to prove it through these cases. Okay. So now we're going to take it one logical step forward, and don't worry, I'll finish in time. So you have more time for questions. So, okay, so women are not required to procreate. They can sterilize themselves after they've had 2 children. What about contraception? What about preventing pregnancy altogether? This is another text from the Talmud. Rabbi Bebai recited before Rabbi Nachman. 3 women use the moch. Moch is soft cotton. 3 women use the moch in their intercourse. A minor, a pregnant woman, and a nursing woman. The minor, in other words, a girl under the age of 12, so there was child marriages, sometimes, rare, but they did exist. A minor because she might become pregnant and as a result might die. In other words, she's in that liminal state where she could get pregnant, but she's not really physiologically developed enough to carry a pregnancy safely to term, so we protect her by saying she can use contraception. That's the minor, that's the girl under age 12. And then they discuss what is the age of the minor from age 11 and 1 day until the age of 12 years and 1 day. That's that dangerous year. Under the age of 11, there's, in their worldview, there's no danger that she would get pregnant because she's not gone through puberty yet. And over the age of 12 and 1 day, she is mature, physically mature, she can carry a pregnancy to term. This is their opinion of Rabbi Meir. The sages, however, say the one as well as the other carries on her intercourse in the usual way, and mercy will be vouchsafed from heaven. As it is said, the Lord preserves the simple. So this is actually, we don't have time to go into the complication of this text. There are 2 opinions. One opinion says that 3 types of women use contraception. And then it specifies who the minor is. The minor is between 11 and 12. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And then the majority says, well, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, but our opinion is that this one and this one, they can carry on their intercourse and God will take care of her. Who are they talking about? So the sort of minimalist interpretation is that they're talking about that girl between the age of 11 and 12. The maximalist interpretation is they're talking about all three women: the minor, the nursing mother, and the pregnant woman. So there are three different kinds of women with three different kinds of dangers. The minor, we explained what the danger is. The pregnant woman might, this is the rabbi's idea, because their physiology is a little weak, that there's danger that she'll get pregnant again. She's pregnant, let's say, with a 3-month-old baby, she could get pregnant again. The new baby will push the old baby and smush it, and it will come out flat as a sandal. That's literally the word they use. And where did they get that idea? It's not as crazy as it sounds. They got that idea because when you deliver twins, sometimes what you see is that there's a twin baby and then there's the remains of another baby that stop developing. It's not that uncommon in pregnancies that start as twin pregnancies, and then one fetus stops developing, and when you do at the birth, you see a baby, and then you see some bones and some tissue, and you could see there was another baby there. So that's where they got that idea. In the nursing woman, what's the danger there? They say in the continuation of the text that the taste and the consistency of the milk that she's feeding the baby, that she's nursing, may change. She would have to wean that baby prematurely, and that baby might die. So these are very practical concerns for safety of the mother or the baby. Without going into any of the details, the later medieval commentators fall into two categories. One category says, so these three women have to use contraception because they're in danger. Other women who are in less danger, they can do whatever they want. The law doesn't specify. That's the more lenient interpretation in terms of use of contraception. Because this text only talks about these three women, it seems to say that they have to use it. But notice that it doesn't say they have to use it, it just says they do it. So it's not a legal statement, it's a descriptive statement. So one way to read it is to say they have to, because obviously we can see that they're in danger, they have to use contraception, other women can do whatever they want. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation, this is also from the Middle Ages, says those three women who are in danger are allowed to use contraception. It adds the word are permitted. Other women who are not in as much danger are not allowed. So basically, starting with Rashi and his grandson and students, there's a split in Jewish law between the lenient position that says women in danger must use contraception to protect themselves or an existing child, and other women, it's an open window. And the minimalist, or the more restrictive, that says women who are in danger may use contraception, but other women may not. So that's a whole other thing. And finally, taking it one more step, what about abortion, which is contraception in a more aggressive way, if you will. And we're just going to read a very short text, and I'm going to tell you that in the Middle Ages, starting really with Maimonides, there's a very long discussion. So in my book, there's a whole chapter on it, and there are whole books about it. But I'm just going to give you the key text that all of the discussion is based on. So this is from a passage in the Mishnah. If a woman is having difficulty giving birth, one cuts up the fetus within her and takes it out limb by limb, because her life takes precedence over its life. Once its greater part has emerged, you do not touch it, because you may not set aside one life for another. So this goes back to a very foundational principle in Jewish law, which is that you can't choose one life over another. All lives are of equal value. You can't say your life is worth more because you just got the Nobel Prize, congratulations. You didn't get it, so her life is worth more. You can't do that. All lives are of equal value. And there are terrible, tragic situations where you just have to stand with your hands by your side and wait to see what will happen. So, if a woman is already, if a baby is halfway out, another version of this says if the baby's head is out, and any obstetrician here will tell you that once the head is out, that's usually more than 50%. Once the head is out, once most of the baby is out, if there's a problem, you cannot intervene, unless you know that you can save both of them. If it's one life against the other, you just have to pray. However, if there's problems before that, in the beginning of the birth process, and the mother's life is in danger, you can abort the baby in a very graphic. You just cut it up and take it out piece by piece in order to save the mother's life, because she's a person who is alive, and the fetus, up until it's out of her body, is considered a part of her body, just like her thigh. It says in another part of the text. So obviously you can amputate your leg in order to save your life. So fetus that has not been born is just like a piece of your body, and it can be killed in order to save your life. So I'm going to stop here. There's obviously a lot more, but what if this and what if that, and maybe you'll ask some of those questions.